The camera lingers on weathered hands, strong, steady, but marked by 8 decades of life. They belong to Tom Selleck, sitting in the study of his avocado ranch, surrounded by memorabilia from a career that spanned over half a century. The famous mustache is now silver, but those piercing blue eyes still hold the same intensity that captivated audiences in Magnum PI. Among the photographs on his desk, one stands out. Selleck alongside James Garner, both in costume from the Rockford Files, smiling in that particular way actors do when they're genuinely enjoying each other's company, not just posing for publicity. "I never told anyone the full story," Selleck says, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "About what he taught me, what he saved me from, and why I kept some of it quiet all these years." For years, Hollywood has whispered about the bond between these two icons, one who defined television cool in the 70s, the other who carried that torch into the 80s. Their paths crossed, diverged, and somehow always found ways to reconnect across decades in an industry notorious for its short memory and shorter loyalties. What happens when your mentor becomes your friend? And later, when that friend carries secrets about your career that could have changed everything? What do you owe to their memory? And what do you owe to the truth? As Tom Selleck now approaches his 9th decade, he's finally ready to speak about the relationship that shaped not just his acting technique, but his entire approach to fame, family, and the high-stakes balancing act of a life lived both in front of and away from the cameras. And it begins with a story few have ever heard. But here's where it gets complicated. At 80, Tom Selleck finally tells the truth about James Garner. Not a tabloid expose or posthumous score settling, but rather a long overdue acknowledgement of an extraordinary friendship that helped define two of television's most beloved figures. This is the story of how one actor's quiet mentorship and protection of another transcended the competitive nature of Hollywood, and why Selleck chose to keep certain aspects of their relationship private until now. In this exploration, we'll uncover the genuine truth about an intergenerational Hollywood bond that survived 5 decades of an industry designed to pit stars against each other. We'll examine how Garner, who passed away in 2014 at age 86, provided not just professional guidance, but a blueprint for navigating fame with integrity that Selleck would later follow and pass on to others. Today, with the perspective of 8 decades behind him, Selleck opens up about debts unpaid, lessons learned, and the kinds of industry truths that rarely make it to interviews. His revelations shed new light not just on his own journey from struggling actor to cultural icon, but on Garner's character beyond the roles that made him famous. This is not about scandal or sensation. It's about something far more rare in Hollywood. Genuine gratitude, professional respect that evolved into friendship, and the courage to acknowledge the people who make our success possible, even when the cameras aren't rolling. It's about how two men from different generations managed to maintain authenticity in an industry often allergic to it, and it's a story that nearly went untold. Thomas William Selleck was born in Detroit in 1945, a child of the post-war boom, who moved with his family to California's San Fernando Valley when he was just a boy. His father, Robert, a real estate investor and executive, instilled in him a Midwestern work ethic that would later become Selleck's professional signature. His mother, Martha, cultivated the family-first mentality that would eventually lead Selleck to make career decisions that puzzled Hollywood but preserved his sense of self. "My dad always said, 'A man is only as good as his word,'" Selleck recalls. He wasn't talking about acting. He was talking about life. As a lanky 6'4" athlete at Grant High School and later at USC, young Tom showed little initial interest in performance beyond a natural ease with people. Basketball, not acting, was his first love. When a coach suggested modeling might earn him some extra money, Selleck approached it with the same disciplined pragmatism he brought to sports. That practicality, seeing acting initially as simply a job to be done well rather than an avenue to fame, would later resonate deeply with Garner's own unpretentious approach to the profession. What almost no one realized was that this tall, somewhat reserved young man possessed an almost photographic memory for mannerisms and behaviors. Long before he had acting training, Selleck was an observer, noticing how people carried themselves, how they expressed emotion through subtle gestures rather than grand declarations. This trait, This watchfulness would later form the foundation of his connection with Garner, a master of the unspoken moment. By the time he returned from his National Guard service in the early 1970s, Selleck had accumulated a handful of commercials and minor roles, but remained unknown to the broader public. He was, however, developing a reputation among casting directors for his reliability and preparation, qualities that would soon catch the eye of someone who embodied these same values on a much larger stage. And that's when everything changed. 1975 marked the crossroads moment in Tom Selleck's early career, though he couldn't possibly have known it at the time. After years of commercials, bit parts, and a stint as the Marlboro Man in print ads, Selleck had begun the grueling cycle familiar to countless aspiring actors: audition, rejection, occasional small role, repeat. He'd appeared in episodes of The FBI and Marcus Welby, MD, but nothing that suggested stardom was imminent. When his agent called about a guest spot on the Rockford Files, Selleck viewed it pragmatically. Another day's work, another credit on the resume. The role wasn't large. Lance White, a too-perfect by-the-book private investigator who would serve as a comedic foil to James Garner's more unorthodox Jim Rockford. What Selleck couldn't anticipate was how this brief encounter would ripple through his professional life for decades to come. "I was terrified," Selleck admits now. Garner was already a legend. Maverick, the great escape. He'd worked with everyone. And there I was, this tall, awkward guy who'd done a bunch of failed TV pilots. But something unexpected happened on set. Garner, already a television icon and movie star, took an interest in the newcomer. Known for his generosity toward supporting actors, Garner did something unusual with Selleck. He began actively coaching him between takes, sharing the camera techniques and subtle acting adjustments he'd learned over decades in the business. "He pulled me aside after my first scene," Selleck remembers, and said, "Kid, you've got something, but you're thinking too much. This isn't theater. On TV, less is more. Let the camera find you. Don't chase it." That simple guidance, delivered without condescension, would become the foundation of Selleck's entire approach to television acting. And it came from a man who had no obligation to mentor a one-episode guest star. What Selleck couldn't know was that Garner had recognized something in the younger actor that few others had spotted yet, a natural authenticity that couldn't be taught. Now, if you're wondering why this brief interaction proved so pivotal, the path from that guest role on the Rockford Files to genuine stardom wasn't immediate for Selleck. Throughout the late 1970s, he continued building his resume with guest appearances and small film roles, including the 1979 disaster film Concrete Cowboys and a recurring role in The Sacketts. But the lessons from Garner were quietly taking root in his performances: the economy of movement, the trust in stillness, the understanding that television acting required a different approach than film or stage. When Selleck was cast as Thomas Magnum in Magnum PI in 1980, the role that would define his career arrived with a set of challenges. How to play a private investigator character without simply copying the established templates, including Garner's Rockford? Selleck made a crucial decision. Where many TV detectives were world-weary or cynical, his Magnum would maintain an optimism and moral center beneath the surface charm. Magnum PI ran for 8 seasons, earning Selleck an Emmy Award in 1984 and establishing him as one of television's most recognizable stars. During this period, he also made strategic moves into film with High Road to China, Lassiter, and most notably, 3 Men and a Baby, which became the highest-grossing film of that year. Through these years of ascending fame, Selleck and Garner maintained contact, not daily or even monthly, but the kind of steady, professional friendship that included dinners when schedules aligned and occasional phone calls when one spotted the other's work and wanted to offer congratulations. What made their connection unusual in Hollywood was its complete lack of competitive edge, despite both men essentially occupying the same leading man space. "We played similar types of characters," Selleck notes, private eyes with a sense of humor who could handle themselves in a fight. "By all Hollywood logic, we should have been rivals. But Jim never saw it that way. He once told me, 'This town's got room for both of us, kid.'" But behind this supportive professional relationship lay a deeper bond, one that would be tested during one of the most challenging periods of Selleck's career, when a decision he made threatened to derail everything he'd built. But here's where it gets complicated. James Garner entered Hollywood nearly 2 decades before Selleck, rising to fame as the charming gambler Brett Maverick in the television western Maverick. By the time he created the character of Jim Rockford for the Rockford Files, Garner had established himself as that rarest of Hollywood commodities, a television star who successfully transitioned to film and back again, maintaining his credibility and audience appeal across decades. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Garner approached acting as a craft rather than an art, a job to be done well, without pretension or method acting extremes. This pragmatic approach resonated deeply with Selleck, who had entered the profession without formal training or burning artistic ambitions. Jim was the anti-Hollywood movie star, Selleck explains. He showed up prepared, treated crew with respect, did the work without complaint, and went home to his family. Same wife his whole life, no scandals, no ego trips. He made it all look simple, but that consistency is the hardest thing to maintain in this business. The parallels in their career trajectories created a natural kinship. Both men found their greatest success on television while making occasional forays into film. Both played characters with clear moral codes beneath their casual exteriors. Both maintained unusually stable personal lives by industry standards. And both approached fame with a certain wariness, recognizing its rewards while remaining clear-eyed about its costs. But their relationship wasn't without complexity. Garner, as the established star, initially held the power to elevate or dismiss the younger actor. What made his mentorship remarkable was how freely he offered professional insights that others might have hoarded as competitive advantages. "He showed me how to position myself for the camera without looking like I was posing," Selleck recalls. "He taught me about hitting marks while making it look natural." These sound like small things, but they're the difference between a performance that works on screen and one that doesn't. What Selleck didn't fully appreciate, until years later, was how unusual Garner's generosity was in an industry built on competition. While other established stars might view rising talent as threats, Garner seemed genuinely invested in Selleck's success. And that unexpected support would become crucial when Selleck faced a decision that could have ended his career before it truly began. What almost no one realized was, as Magnum PI catapulted Selleck from working actor to household name, the pressures of sudden fame brought challenges that weren't visible to audiences watching from home. The grueling shooting schedule in Hawaii, often 14-hour days up to 10 months a year, isolated him from Hollywood's power centers while simultaneously making normal life impossible due to his growing recognition. The show filmed on location, which meant I was basically living in Hawaii 8 months of the year, Selleck explains. That's paradise for a vacation, but when you're working those hours, you're mostly seeing the inside of a studio and your hotel room. The physical demands were equally taxing. Unlike many television stars who relied on stunt doubles for every physical moment, Selleck insisted on performing many of his own stunts, a decision that led to accumulated injuries, including a damaged shoulder that still troubles him decades later. The famous mustache that became his trademark also became a kind of prison. Studio executives wrote clauses into his contracts forbidding him from shaving it, even between seasons. During this period of intense professional pressure, Selleck would occasionally reach out to Garner, who understood the unique challenges of carrying an action-oriented television series. Their conversations rarely focused on acting technique by this point, but rather on something more valuable: how to maintain perspective when fame threatens to distort your sense of self. Jim told me early on, "Remember, they're not paying you for the hours when things go smoothly. They're paying you for the hours when everything goes wrong. You're exhausted and you still have to deliver," Selleck recalls. That stuck with me through some very tough shoots. What remained unspoken in these conversations was the toll such work took on personal relationships. Garner had famously maintained a stable marriage throughout his career, a rarity in Hollywood, while Selleck's first marriage to model Jacqueline Ray ended in 1982, a casualty of his demanding schedule and newfound fame. The dissolution of that relationship became a turning point in how Selleck approached the balance between career and personal life, a rebalancing that would be heavily influenced by Garner's example. But the greatest professional test of their relationship was still to come, a moment when a single decision would alter the trajectory of Selleck's career and reveal the true nature of Garner's mentorship. And that's when everything changed. The truth that Tom Selleck has kept relatively quiet until now centers on what may be the most significant career crossroads he ever faced, and how James Garner helped him navigate it with his career and integrity intact. In 1980, as Magnum PI was just beginning production, Selleck was offered what seemed like the role of a lifetime: Indiana Jones in Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. He had auditioned and won the part, beating out numerous established stars. For an actor still fighting to establish himself in leading roles, this was the opportunity that could transform him from television personality to genuine movie star. Then came the devastating complication. Universal Studios, which had Selleck under contract for Magnum, refused to allow him time to film both projects. Despite extensive negotiations and attempts to work around scheduling conflicts, Selleck was forced to turn down Indiana Jones. The role went instead to Harrison Ford, launching him into global superstardom. "What people don't know is that I called Jim when I was in the middle of this impossible situation," Selleck reveals now. "I was devastated. This was Spielberg and Lucas, the biggest filmmakers in the world, offering me the chance of a lifetime, and I had to say no because of a TV contract for a show that hadn't even aired yet." Garner's advice was characteristic, straightforward, and grounded in personal experience. He told me, "The worst mistake you can make right now is to become bitter. That bitterness will show up in your work, and audiences will see it. You honor your contract. You do the best damn job you can on this show, and I promise you other opportunities will come." What Selleck has never publicly shared before is that Garner went beyond mere advice. He made calls on Selleck's behalf to industry insiders, vouching for the younger actor's professionalism and talent, helping ensure that this forced decision wouldn't be viewed as Selleck being difficult or unprofessional. "Jim knew what it was like to be bound by television contracts," Selleck explains. "In the 60s, he'd sued Warner Brothers over his Maverick contract and won, but it cost him years of his career. He didn't want me to make either mistake, neither breaking my contract nor becoming so angry about it that I poisoned my own future." This guidance at a moment of profound professional disappointment revealed the depth of Garner's investment in Selleck's career, and the beginning of a mentorship that would extend far beyond acting technique. But here's where it gets complicated. The narrative that has persisted in Hollywood circles about Selleck's missed opportunity with Indiana Jones only captures a fraction of the truth. The popular version suggests simple bad timing, a cruel twist of fate that kept Selleck from superstardom. The reality, as Selleck now reveals, was far more nuanced and speaks volumes about both his character and Garner's influence. "People assume I must have been bitter for years about missing out on Indiana Jones," Selleck explains. "But what Jim helped me understand was that this wasn't really about one role. It was about how I wanted to define success in this business. Was it about becoming the biggest star possible, or was it about building a sustainable career where my word meant something?" The lesser-known context is that Universal's refusal to release Selleck for Raiders wasn't simply corporate stubbornness. The studio had invested heavily in Magnum PI, tailoring the character specifically to Selleck's strengths. Moreover, they had stood by him through 7 failed television pilots prior to Magnum, a level of patience rare in the industry. "Jim pointed out something crucial that changed my perspective," Selleck recalls. He said, "Tom, do you realize how many actors would kill to have your problem? You're not fighting for work. You've got too much of it. That's a blessing, not a curse." What the public narrative also misses is how this moment defined Selleck's approach to his entire subsequent career. Rather than chasing movie stardom at all costs, the conventional Hollywood path, he embraced television as his primary medium, occasionally making films that interested him rather than simply offered the biggest paychecks or exposure. This philosophy directly mirrored Garner's own career choices. Despite success in films like The Great Escape and Victor Victoria, Garner repeatedly returned to television, recognizing it as a medium where character development could unfold more naturally over time. It was a perspective vastly different from the prevailing Hollywood wisdom that viewed television as merely a stepping stone to real success in film. What Jim taught me was that longevity in this business isn't about avoiding disappointment, it's about how you respond to it, Selleck says. Do you become bitter or do you become better? This lesson would be tested again and again throughout both men's careers, but never more dramatically than when Selleck faced the aftermath of his most unexpected success. Now, if you're wondering, 1987 marked a pivot point in Tom Selleck's career trajectory, one that would once again bring James Garner's guidance into sharp focus. After 7 successful seasons of Magnum PI, Selleck had finally managed to balance his television schedule with film work, starring in the comedy 3 Men and a Baby. To everyone's surprise, perhaps especially Selleck's, the film became the highest-grossing movie of the year, suddenly repositioning him as a viable film star. The industry that had once pigeonholed him as just a television actor now came calling with film offers and the implicit suggestion that he should leave television behind for the supposedly greener pastures of cinema. It was the exact career opening that most actors dream of, the chance to pivot from the grind of a weekly series to the prestige and paychecks of movie stardom. And that's when everything changed. Rather than following the conventional wisdom, Selleck made a decision that baffled many of his advisors. He returned to Magnum for its 8th and final season, honoring his contract and commitment to properly conclude the series that had made him a star. I called Jim after the movie hit big, Selleck recounts. Everyone was telling me to leverage this success, to use it as my ticket out of television. Jim just laughed and said, "Kid, you're finally facing the good kind of problem. Now you get to decide what success looks like for you, not what other people think it should look like." Instead, this perspective, that genuine success meant the freedom to make choices aligned with personal values rather than industry expectations, became the compass for Selleck's subsequent career. After Magnum concluded in 1988, rather than jumping immediately into another project, Selleck took an extended break, moved to his ranch, and carefully considered his next steps. Jim told me something during that period that I've never forgotten, Selleck says. He said, "The most valuable thing you have in this business isn't your fame or your talent, it's your time. Once you realize that, you stop letting other people decide how you should spend it." This philosophy, distinctly counter to Hollywood norms, led Selleck to make choices that prioritized personal fulfillment over traditional notions of career advancement. He married Jilly Mack in 1987, and when their daughter Hannah was born in 1988, Selleck significantly reduced his workload to be present for her childhood, a decision directly influenced by observing Garner's own family-centered approach to his career. What began as professional mentorship had evolved into something deeper, a shared vision of how to navigate fame without being consumed by it. But here's where it gets complicated. The 1990s and early 2000s revealed the full impact of the career philosophy Selleck had absorbed from Garner, a path marked by selectivity rather than ubiquity, quality over quantity, and a willingness to reinvent himself rather than cling to past successes. Instead of attempting to replicate Magnum PI or chase ever bigger film roles, Selleck made deliberate choices that expanded his range while maintaining his authentic screen presence. His portrayal of aging cowboy Matthew Quigley in the 1990 western Quigley Down Under showcased a more nuanced dramatic range. A series of Jesse Stone TV movies beginning in 2005 allowed him to explore a darker, more complex character than audiences had previously associated with him. His recurring role on Friends as Richard Burke, deliberately playing against his action hero type, revealed comedic subtleties that surprised viewers who knew him primarily as Magnum. Jim called me after he saw the first Jesse Stone movie, Selleck remembers. He said, "Now you're doing the kind of work that lasts." No car chases, just a man's face telling the story. Coming from him, that meant everything. During this period, Selleck and Garner's professional relationship deepened into genuine friendship. They weren't in daily contact. Both were private men with busy lives, but their conversations took on the comfortable rhythm of veterans who had survived the same battles and emerged with their perspective intact. When Selleck accepted the role of Frank Reagan in Blue Bloods in 2010, beginning what would become one of the longest-running dramas in television history, he incorporated subtle elements that paid homage to Garner's on-screen presence. The measured speech pattern, the ability to command attention without raising his voice, the economy of movement that communicates authority. I never told anyone I was channeling aspects of Jim in that role, Selleck admits, but those who knew both of us well could see it. It wasn't imitation, it was appreciation. What almost no one realized was that by this point, their relationship had evolved beyond mentor and protege. Garner, facing health challenges including a stroke in 2008, increasingly sought Selleck's counsel about career decisions and industry matters. The guidance had become mutual, the friendship equal. This second-act evolution reflected something both men understood deeply, that lasting relevance in Hollywood isn't about youth or even constant reinvention, but about a consistent authenticity that audiences recognize and trust. Jim taught me that actors don't age out of relevance, Selleck says. They only age out of authenticity if they start trying to be something they're not. But the most profound truth about their relationship was still largely private, until now. Now, if you're wondering, the deeper truth about Tom Selleck and James Garner's relationship, one that Selleck has been reluctant to discuss until reaching his 8th decade, centers on a professional debt that transcended mere career advice or occasional support. It speaks to a pattern of intentional, behind-the-scenes advocacy that Garner provided without seeking credit or acknowledgement. What I need people to understand about Jim, Selleck says with evident emotion, is that he didn't just help me navigate difficult moments. He actively created opportunities for me when he had absolutely nothing to gain from it. The full extent of this advocacy became clear to Selleck only years after their initial work together on the Rockford Files. Through industry conversations and eventually direct confirmation from Garner himself, Selleck learned that after his guest appearance, Garner had personally recommended him to multiple producers and studio executives, not as a favor to Selleck, whom he barely knew at that point, but because he genuinely believed in his potential. More significantly, when Magnum PI was being developed, the producers initially had a very different type of actor in mind for the lead. It was Garner who suggested they consider Selleck, a recommendation that carried substantial weight given Garner's stature in the industry. He never told me he'd done that, Selleck reveals. I found out years later from one of the producers. When I asked Jim about it, he just shrugged and said, "You were right for the part." It wasn't a favor. It was just good casting. This pattern of quiet advocacy continued throughout both their careers. When Selleck faced industry skepticism after focusing on his family and being more selective with roles in the 1990s, Garner would casually mention Selleck's name in conversations with network executives and producers, keeping him in the industry consciousness without Selleck even knowing it was happening. What I want to make absolutely clear, Selleck emphasizes, is that this truth about Jim isn't about exposing some hidden agenda or dark secret. It's about giving proper credit to someone who never sought it, who believed that doing the right thing privately was more important than getting credit for it publicly. This philosophy of quiet integrity, of helping others without expectation of reward or recognition, became the most valuable lesson Selleck learned from Garner, one that shaped not just his career decisions, but his entire approach to his position of influence in Hollywood. The truth about Jim Garner, Selleck says with conviction, is that his greatest performances weren't on camera at all. They were in how he lived his life when nobody was watching. And that's when everything changed. Behind the familiar public personas of both men existed private lives that anchored them amidst the artifice of Hollywood, foundations that gave context to their professional choices and their enduring friendship. For James Garner, this foundation was his remarkably stable 58-year marriage to Lois Clark. In an industry notorious for disposable relationships, Garner's dedication to his family provided a constant that transcended the uncertainties of his profession. Despite his fame, he maintained a clear separation between his public persona and his private life, rarely discussing his family in interviews and protecting their privacy with quiet determination. Selleck observed this example closely and ultimately followed a similar path after meeting his wife Gilly Mack in 1987 while performing in Cats in London. Their marriage, now in its fourth decade, and their decision to raise their daughter Hannah on a working avocado ranch in Ventura County, California, deliberately removed from Hollywood, mirrors Garner's approach to creating sanctuary from the industry's demands. What Jim showed me, Selleck reflects, was that you don't have to live in the bubble. You can step away, be a normal person with normal relationships, and then bring that authenticity back to your work. Both men shared another characteristic rarely discussed in celebrity profiles, a dedication to practical service that extended beyond charitable donations or ceremonial appearances. Garner served in the Korean War, where he received 2 Purple Hearts, while Selleck served in the California National Guard during the Vietnam era. This shared military experience, though from different conflicts, created an unspoken bond of understanding about duty and service that influenced their professional ethics. Their faith journeys, while personal, also played significant roles in shaping their characters and choices. Garner maintained a quiet spirituality throughout his life, while Selleck has been more open about his Christian faith in recent years, acknowledging its centrality to his decision-making and worldview. One thing we both understood, Selleck says, was that there's something humbling about believing in something bigger than yourself. It keeps the ego in check in an industry that constantly tells you how special you are. These private anchors, family, service, faith, created a foundation that allowed both men to engage with Hollywood on their own terms, viewing success not as an end in itself, but as a platform for living according to deeper values. What almost no one realized was how these shared values cemented their bond far beyond their professional similarities or career parallels. But here's where it gets complicated. You might be wondering why Tom Selleck waited until his 80-year-old year to speak so openly about his relationship with James Garner. The answer lies not in any reluctance to acknowledge Garner's influence, but in Selleck's characteristic modesty and his respect for Garner's preference for privacy. Jim never wanted to be thanked publicly, Selleck explains. He always said, "If you want to thank me, do the same for someone else without taking credit." Now that he's gone, I feel it's important that people understand the kind of man he truly was. Was there ever professional rivalry between them? Surprisingly, no. Despite occupying similar spaces in television, both playing private investigators with distinctive personalities, neither man viewed the other as competition. "We were different enough that we never went up for the same parts," Selleck notes. Besides, Jim never saw other actors as rivals. He used to say, "There's enough work for the good ones." What about the infamous mustaches that became signatures for both men? Was that deliberate paralleling? Selleck laughs at this question. "Pure coincidence. I grew mine originally for a film role, and the Magnum producers insisted I keep it. Jim had his before I had mine. We joked about starting a club, but there was never any intention to look similar." Did they ever consider working together again after those early Rockford Files episodes? "We talked about it several times," Selleck reveals. "There were a couple of projects we developed that never quite came together. By the time we were both established enough to make it happen on our terms, Jim's health had begun to decline. It's one of my few professional regrets." What would Garner think about Selleck sharing these stories now? "He'd probably give me that look, the one where he half smiles and shakes his head," Selleck reflects. "Then he'd say something like, 'As long as the stories make me sound good, kid.' But I think he'd understand that some examples of integrity are worth sharing, especially in times when they seem in short supply." But here's where it gets complicated. As Tom Selleck reflects back across 8 decades of life and over 50 years in Hollywood, the perspective gained through time has only deepened his appreciation for what James Garner offered him, not just professionally, but as a model for living with integrity in an industry often lacking it. "When you're younger in this business," Selleck observes, "you think success is about the roles you land or the money you make. As you get older, you realize it's really about whether you can look in the mirror and respect the person looking back at you." Jim understood that from the beginning. This hard-earned perspective allowed Selleck to reconcile the apparent contradictions in his career choices. Turning down blockbuster opportunities to honor commitments, stepping away from Hollywood at the height of his fame to raise his daughter, returning to television when film stardom beckoned. What might have seemed like career missteps to outside observers were, in fact, deliberate choices informed by values that transcended conventional ambition. In the weathered hands we glimpsed at the beginning of our story, the hands that have carried weapons on screen for decades, but in reality have more often been occupied with the practical work of tending avocado trees on his ranch, we see the physical embodiment of Selleck's philosophy. Work that matters, commitments honored, a life built on substance rather than appearance. The last time I saw Jim before he passed, Selleck shares, his voice momentarily unsteady. He was in declining health but still completely himself. He looked at me and said, "We did okay, didn't we, kid?" Just that. And he was right. Not because we became famous, plenty of people achieve that, but because we managed to do it without losing ourselves in the process. This, perhaps, is the ultimate truth Tom Selleck wants to share about James Garner. Not that he was perfect or without flaws, but that he offered a roadmap for navigating fame without being corrupted by it. A way to succeed on one's own terms. A demonstration that integrity and longevity in Hollywood aren't mutually exclusive. In that sense, every role Selleck has played since those early days on the Rockford Files set, every choice he's made about what projects to take and how to conduct himself, has been in some measure a tribute to the man who showed him the way. What almost no one realized was that the true legacy between these two men wasn't just artistic influence. It was the passing of a torch of integrity that Selleck now carries forward. On a crisp fall morning in Ojai, California, Tom Selleck walks the rows of avocado trees on his ranch, a daily ritual that grounds him in something more permanent than Hollywood's fleeting attention. At 80, he moves more deliberately than in his Magnum days, but with the same purposeful stride that has characterized his presence on screen for half a century. "I think about Jim almost every day," he says, pausing to examine a cluster of ripening fruit, not in a mournful way, but with gratitude. We're shaped by the people who believe in us before we fully believe in ourselves. The Hollywood that both men navigated has changed dramatically since they first crossed paths in 1975. New platforms, new stars, new definitions of success. Yet the example they established, of professionalism without pretension, of stardom without surrender of self, remains as relevant as ever in an industry still searching for sustainable models of celebrity. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to their relationship is how Selleck now mentors younger actors on the Blue Blood set, offering the same kind of steady, unassuming guidance that Garner once provided him. The torch passes forward, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but in quiet conversations between scenes, in examples set without fanfare, in opportunities created without expectation of credit. In the end, the truth about Tom Selleck and James Garner isn't found in Hollywood anecdotes or career milestones, but in a simple recognition that in an industry built on illusion, both men dedicated themselves to something real, a commitment to substance over image, to lasting value over temporary advantage. And perhaps that's the most revolutionary act possible in Hollywood, to remember always that the work matters, but how you do the work matters more.